Hilchos Kilayim Perek Shishi, the laws of the forbidden mixtures, chapter 6. We're going to continue today the laws of Kilei HaKerem. Kilei HaKerem is forbidden mixtures in the vineyard. Besides for planting seeds together that's forbidden, you also can't plant a vegetable or a grain in a vineyard, or the opposite. You can't plant a vine within a grain field or a vegetable field. So today we're going to get into the details of, first of all, when you do plant a vegetable or a grain in a vineyard, besides for the grain becoming a problem, how much of the vineyard becomes a problem, and also different details about what classifies as a vineyard. And this is one of those chapters where you see a classic example of when you learn the Rambam straight, it's pretty easy. The laws are pretty straightforward. But when you compare it to the sources, most of the sources of the Rambam here is in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud. You can see it's clear how deep the Rambam went in understanding the Gemara, because in many ways, when you learn the Gemara simply, the Rambam's conclusions don't seem to match, and you have to have many commentaries to justify or to kind of explain how the Rambam fits with what it says in the Gemara. So here we're going to learn again, like a straightforward chapter, and just know that there's tons and tons of depth in every single halacha over here. So the Rambam begins halacha aleph. Hazireya yarak oitvua bekerem. If somebody plants a vegetable or a grain in a vineyard, oy hamekaimoi, or he doesn't plant it, let's say it grows wild, and then he sees it. He notices it in his vineyard, and he maintains it, he lets it be. Ad shehoisif b'masayim. The length of time that it takes to add a 200th of its size. As we learned yesterday, what that means is you basically figure out how long it would take if you would cut it, how long it would take to dry completely, and 1/200th of that time frame is called hoisif b'masayim. So if you leave it for that long in your vineyard, besides for the grain or the vegetable having to be burned, becoming forbidden to have benefit, it also makes forbidden some of the vines around the vegetable or around the grain. How much? 16 amma, 16 cubits. Let's call it 24 feet. Radius, all around, in a circle, not in a square. So for example, we'll just choose, let's say this is a vineyard, okay? Every little dot here represents a vine. And you planted a vegetable, as the commentaries explain it, this is a case where you planted a vegetable at the base of a vine. Right there, right where the vine was, that's where you planted the vegetable, right over here. So typically, vines were spaced at 4 ames, 4 cubits from each other. So in this case, you draw the radius line of 16 amas and make it into a circle. Whatever vines fall into that circle become forbidden. V'royin kol ha'igol, and you treat the entire circle, sherach b'ishtayim u'shleishim amma, which has a diameter of 32 amma, right? Because if it's 16 ammas radius, the diameter is double the radius, so 32 amma in diameter. Ki'ilu hu kulei mole yarak. The way to look at it is you treat the entire circle as if it's full of vegetables. Same way you understand that if the circle were entirely full of vegetables, every vine next to it would become forbidden. So the same thing, even when you plant one individual vegetable, that's how we treat it. We draw a circle and we treat it as if it's full of vegetables, and therefore it forbids all of these vines. V'chol gefen shetia b'toich igul zeh, any vine that's within this circle, niskadsha im hayarak, becomes forbidden together with the vegetable. V'chol shechutz la'igul einon miskadshes, but any any vines outside the circle, all of these vines over here do not become forbidden. Halacha beis b'ameh dvarim amurim. When does this rule apply? That if you're outside the circle, you're safe. Kishahaya bein sifsei ha'igul hazeh ubein shureis hagfanim shechutz aloi yoiser al arba amos. If from the edge of the circle to the next row of vines there was more than 4 ammas. So if the space between vines is more than 4 ammas, let's call it, like the Mishnah says, the source of the Rambam, 5 ammas, so where the circle ends, the next row is more than 4 ammas away. That's when we can say that if you're in the circle, you're forbidden, out of the circle, you're permitted. But if between the edge of the circle and the next row of vines, there was exactly 4 ammas or less, so then we have to actually treat the circle as in this picture over here. You draw this extra thick line over here, kind of the circle kind of extends to the next row. And because there's 4 ammas on each side, so you had a diameter of 32, you add 4 over here, that's 40. Now the circle extends to 40 amas diameter. And then we see kol gefen shatipel b'seich igul zeh shal arbayim amma, whichever vine falls in the circle of 40 amas, harei miskadesha, she becomes forbidden. So the way the commentators explain it basically is, even though I told you before that usually vines are spaced at 4 amas, really the first case is a case where the vines were spaced at 5 amas. And therefore, when the circle ends, it's possible that for the next row, there'll be more than 4 amas. But in a classic case where there's 4 amas or less between the circle and the next row of the vines, then actually the circle kind of expands. Halacha gimel b'amed dvarim amurim. When are all of these laws, the last 2 laws that we learned, that you draw a 16 amma radius and that whole circle becomes forbidden, when is that said? B'zoireya a mekayim toich hakerem. If the problematic vegetable or grain being planted is being planted in middle of the vineyard, as in these pictures where you planted the vegetable right over here in the middle of the circle. Aval hazoireya chutz lakerem b'samuch loy. But let's take this picture for a minute. Is it too dark? Can you see the contrast?
I can see.
Okay, so we'll imagine that the brown is the field, right? And here on the left is the vineyard. And you're planting your wheat or your problematic vegetable outside of the vineyard, v'samuch, but right next to it. So now, hareza mekadesh, shtei shurais shel gefanim, hasmuches lazera, ba'oirech kol hazera. You only forbid 2 rows of vines, the first 2 rows of vines next to the problematic plantation. And even that, how much? Only as long as the problematic planted grain. So in this picture where the wheat goes across the entire length of the vineyard, so these entire 2 rows, all these 8 vines will become forbidden. But let's say, just for example, you only planted the wheat in the middle over here. So then, yes, you'll go 2 rows in, but only at the length of the wheat. So only these 4 vines will become forbidden. Okay, so that's how much of the vines become forbidden. How much of the vines? 2 rows in. How long? Whatever length of plants you planted. Plus the yeser arba amas chutz lazera. Plus 4 amas outwards. So let me say that again. If you had planted along the entire length of the vineyard, so of course the entire length of the vineyard becomes forbidden. But even if you planted not according to the entire length, only part of the length, so then you go 2 rows in, whatever is opposite the wheat is for sure forbidden. Plus you go 4 amas this way and 4 amas that way, and those vines also become forbidden. That's how much of the vines are an issue. How much of the wheat is an issue? Umiskadesh min hazera roichav arba amois beoirech kol hashura shel kerem. Of the wheat, you go like this. Not just 2 rows in. You go 4 amas in. We don't care about rows. Whatever the length is. You draw a line from this edge, 4 amas in, and you go to the length of the entire row of the vines. Assuming, as the commentaries understand it, that you planted the wheat opposite the entire row of the vines. If you planted the wheat parallel to the entire row, then the entire row becomes forbidden, 4 amas inwards. That's all if you planted next to an entire vineyard. Would you have planted this problematic wheat or vegetable next to a single vine? It's not a vineyard. Then it's much of a smaller prohibition. You only go a 6 handbreadth radius, 6 tvachim. It's very short, but 1.5 feet, let's call it. Maybe 2 feet. 2 feet radius. That's how much you make forbidden of the wheat. Halacha dalid, when we talk about vines becoming prohibited or making the wheat prohibited, it has to be more of a mature vine. But yalda paches mitefach, yalda means a young girl, means a young vine. If it's smaller than a tefach, just in its initial stages of growth, it's not even 4 inches tall, einam nekadesha ses hazroim, does not forbid the wheat planted next to it. When is this said? If you have what's called the minimum size of a courtyard, of a vineyard. The minimum size of a vineyard is where you have 5 vines, 2 planted like this, and 1 coming out as a tail. That's how the Rambam understands. Whenever the Mishneh Talmud says, achas yetza zonov, 1 goes out in a tail, it means this. Other commentators say it means this vine would actually be next to this one, so you have like 3 and then 2. The Rambam says it's 2 and 2, and 1 coming out as a tail. This is when we treat the short vines as not powerful enough to forbid the wheat. Avolim hoya kol hakerem came, but let's say somebody planted his entire vineyard with midget vines. So it's clear he has a full vineyard. Then harezem mekadesh. Then they do have the power to forbid the wheat planted next to them like any regular vineyard, either because it's a rabbinic decree or because we don't want people to think that, the same way in this vineyard it's not forbidden, in other vineyards it's also forbidden. The point is that if you have an entire vineyard like that, it definitely makes problems for the wheat planted next to it. Halacha hey, shtei ginois zu al gav zu. You have two gardens or two planting areas, one above the other. So we'll look at this. This is, let's say, a little hill, all earth, all natural earth. One garden down here, another garden up here. Hatachtoina asuya kerem. The bottom one is a vineyard. Somebody planted vines on the bottom part of the embankment, bottom part of the terraced hill. Now he wants to know, I want to plant up here other vegetables or other grains. How close can I get to these vines not to be considered planting next to a vineyard? So the Rambam says, Zayreya esol yoina ad shehu magia la'avir asara tvachim karev lakerem. You can plant on the higher area all the way until you reach a 10 tefach, about 40 inches airspace, to the lower vineyard. In other words, as the commentaries explain it simply, you can actually plant on the slope of the hill until you reach what's called the 10 tefach airspace. Once you reach that, you're already considered in the space of the vine, and it's too close. She'avir asara tvachim samach lakerem. Because the airspace of 10 tvachim next to a vineyard or even next to a single vine, it's forbidden to plant plants over there. That's in this case. What if we flip it? What if the upper one was the vineyard? Okay, you see that? Now the top is the vines. So actually, here you'll be able to get even closer to the vines. You can plant other plants, vegetables, or grains in the bottom area until you reach just 3 tvachim, 12 inches, from the roots of the vines. Why? When you're coming from the top, once you're in somebody's 10 tefach airspace, you're already in their space. But when you're coming from the bottom, you have to be within 3 tvachim of space. That's where the roots begin to reach, and that's where you have to stop planting other plants. Halacha vav, Misha if somebody had already in his field planted vegetables or grains, and he changes his mind, now he wants to make it into a vineyard. You must first take a plow, turn over the earth, and all of the plants in it. Some commentaries even say you have to wait till the seeds rot, like we learned before in chapter 2, and only then do you plant the vines. Do not plant the vines first and then go flipping the earth. What if it was the opposite? First it was planted as a vineyard. Now you change your mind, you want to plant regular plants over there. You must uproot every vine, and only then can you plant the plants. If you didn't want to go through the bother of uprooting all the vines, you're simply going to cut them down until their stump is less than a tefach, less than a handbreadth. So you can't get away from uprooting the vines, but once you've cut it down to a tefach, you can already plant your seeds, and then go ahead later and uproot whatever remains from the vines. Halacha zayin, hamavrich es hagefen ba'aretz, one who layers a vine into the ground. This was very common in those days.
Again, what is mavrich?
Layering. Mavrich means to bend over. Basically, yes. So this is not a vine, but I'm just going to use it as an example. You have a tree, right? So sometimes you want to take a branch and you would layer it underground so it can sprout new roots, and then boom, it would sprout another part of the tree. It seems like people would do the same thing for vines. By the way, why is it called havracha? Berech in Hebrew means a knee. Look at this, just for visualization purposes. Basically what you're doing is, see how that's a person's knee. You're taking the branch and you're putting it in. Zamora? Zamora means a branch also in biblical, in halachic Hebrew. So you have havracha. So let's imagine this is a vine, right? You're taking the vine and you're layering it into the ground. Now, according to the Rambam, in the Talmud there's a big debate, or the common understanding is that you're not taking the entire vine and layering it into the ground. You're simply taking a branch of the vine, like in this picture, a branch from the tree, one branch and layering it in. According to the Rambam, it's clear that he understood the Gemara as talking about taking the entire vine. If a vine growing over here, take the entire head of the vine and you're putting it into the ground. Okay? Hamavrich es hagefen ba'aretz. if you layer a vine into the ground, so we're going to see that the Rambam is basically going to say that even though it's hidden in the ground, planting on top of that area is still considered planting next to a vineyard, unless it's 3 tfachim deep into the earth. That's going to be the point of this law. But first, the Rambam adds an additional point. It says, if somebody layers a vine into the ground, even if he layers the branch through a hollowed out squash. They used to do that. They take a squash, hollow it out, and use that as a pipe for the branch to go through. And this squash is so dry, venases kesila, and it became as tough as a pottery or a clay pipe. Or you actually layered it through a pipe. Now that you put it through a pipe, there's more room to think perhaps the pipe is an interruption. Says the Rambam, it's not an interruption. Only if, after you've layered it, there's 3 tfachim of earth on top of it, or more, then you can plant other plants or vegetables on top of it. But if there was less than that on top of it, it'll be forbidden to plant right above it, because that'll having a vegetable and a grain mixing with the vine. But you can plant right off to the side. That's okay. If you were to layer it through very rough ground, usually sela means a rock, but the commentators explain it to mean hard ground, even though there is not a lot of earth on top of it, only 3 finger breadths, not 3 hand breadths. This would be 3 hand breadths. 3 finger breadths just this thick, but really 3 thumb breadths. That's already permitted to add plants right on top of it, because the roots are not going to go all the way through the hard ground. They're not going to touch the vine. When are all these laws said? These last 2 laws of layering a vine. If you no longer see the base of the vine. But if you still see the base of the vine, you must now distance yourself a 6 tefach, a 6 handbreadth radius before you begin to plant. The same way, we distance ourselves from any single vine, even if it hasn't been layered, as will be explained. Let's take this. We have a full vineyard over here. And you take 3 vines and you layer them in. 3 vines, layer them into the ground, and they're popping up, as you can see over here, layered in, just imagine it, layered in, and popping up elsewhere. If between the core of the vines and the new popped up extension of the vine, there are anywhere between 4 and 8 amas, about, let's call it 6 to 12 feet, they're just considered attached to the rest of the vineyard. It's as if you didn't even layer it, and you have to distance any other planted vegetables or grains from those vines. If not, then, in other words, there's more space, then they don't combine. They're considered their own entity unto themselves. If there was less than 3, you didn't do it to 3 vines, you did it only to 2. They don't combine. They're considered to be individual vines. You simply treat each one as an individual entity. And if you want to plant vegetables or grains next to it, just make the distance of 6 tvachim. You don't require that whole distance for the side of a vineyard. Just as an individual vine, and you're good. Halacha Yud Aleph. Not only somebody who plants right next to a vine. Even if you plant a vegetable or a grain under an extending branch, as we can see here in this picture we showed yesterday, under the extending branch or a leaf of a vine, you make the wheat and the grapes forbidden. Even if looking at the core, at the base of the vine and the base of the wheat is very far. Doesn't matter. It's under the vine, forbidden. Halacha Yud Beis, Hidlas Agefen al Miktsas Apifyares. So we're going to have this much more at length in chapter 8. But this is a trellis. Trellis is a little structure that you make for climbing plants. You want the vines to kind of grow over it, and it makes a nice decoration. Just also allows for the vines to spread. So apifyares, according to the Rambam, are the lattice work that you put down to form the trellis. So you have a vine, and you draped it, hidla means you draped the vine over part of the trellis lattice work. Not the whole thing. In this picture, you see half of it is covered, it's still open to the sun, half of it is covered. Says the Rambam, even though the prohibition really is only to plant under the vines directly, in this case, lo yizra tachas moisar ha'apifyares. You can't even plant other things under the leftover area of the trellis lattice work. Even if there's no leaves, there's no branches there right now, because they're going to come. If you did plant, since the bottom line, practically speaking, there is no, the plants aren't under the covering of the vine, it's allowed. Same thing if you didn't have this wood. Let's say you used a non-fruit bearing tree as the trellis. You trained the vine to go over the branches of a non-fruit bearing tree. Like a cedar or a pine tree. Same laws. The non-fruit bearing tree is treated as a trellis. Whatever branches are covered, you cannot plant under there. Whatever branches aren't covered, ideally you also shouldn't plant there. If you did, it's okay. But if you were to train the vine over a fruit-bearing tree, in the first instance, initially, it's permitted to plant under the branches where the vines haven't yet reached. A person is not in his mind going to nullify, going to cancel the purpose of a fruit-bearing tree just to be used as a trellis. When you make a trellis, that's all it is. It's exclusively for the vines. Yes, the vines haven't reached there yet, but they're going to. Therefore, it's forbidden. Same with a non-fruit-bearing tree. You don't have another purpose for it besides for being a trellis. A fruit-bearing tree, there is another purpose. And therefore, if the vines haven't reached any specific place, you could initially, lechatchila, plant under there. If indeed on the fruit-bearing tree, the vines in the end are going to go and travel, and they're going to reach a point where they're over the plants, you'll simply move the vines around to somewhere else, shift their direction, and make sure that it's not covering the plants. Let's say you did what you weren't supposed to do. You planted under the open area of a trellis, or under the open area of a non-fruit-bearing tree where the vines haven't reached. And then came the vines, as they do, kept climbing, and now they're over your plants. What do you do? In this case, you cannot leave it as is, and you also can't move the vines back. Since you did what you weren't supposed to do, the rabbis fine you. They don't let you get away with just training the vines back to a different direction. They said, what must you do? You have to uproot the plants that are under the vines. Reeds that project from the trellis. Aris is the Rambam's word for trellis. So let's use this case, okay? You have these are the poles here. The main trellis is on top of the poles. But then you have these reeds sticking out beyond the main area of the trellis. The chasalei and lepaskan, and the person has pity on them. He doesn't want to cut them off. In other words, pity means, in his mind, he doesn't want to cut these pieces of wood off. You don't want to destroy the lattice work. You don't want to destroy the trellis. So even though these are really extensions, but for you, they're part of the trellis. Says the Rambam, it's allowed to plant under them. But if you put the reed there to begin with as part of the trellis, if you had in mind, I want this to be an extension so that there can be a trellis, then you cannot plant under them. Because then in your mind, they're literally part of the host area for the grapes. If a branch, so not a reed of the trellis, if a branch of the vine now extends from the trellis or from a single vine that's been draped on a pole. Let's say this would be a dullis. You have a phone wire, there's a vine climbing up it. You have a branch sticking out the area. We have to treat it as a vine, and you cannot plant under it. So how do you measure? You take a plumb line, those weights that the builders use to see if a wall is straight, and you treat it as if there's an imaginary plumb line coming down, ad haaretz, straight to the ground. The asher is re'atachta. Anything which is under the area of this extending single vine, forbidden to plant under it. Same thing if you would take a vine and stretch it from tree to tree. So you have a vine training on this tree, boom, you take it all the way, schlep it here, to a second tree. It's forbidden to plant anywhere under this area, because this vine is considered, even though it's not based here, it's just extending over, doesn't matter. Your plants cannot be roofed by a vine. It gets even further. Kashar cheva legmi bizmayra. Let's say you tied a rope or a reed to a vine. So here we have it, okay? It's just my imagined picture. You have a vine growing straight up over here. You take a rope, tie it to the vine, the kashar haresha acher ba'ilan, or ha'echad ba'ilan, and you tie its other end to the tree. So here there's actually no vines involved in this area. You have a tree here and a vine here, and you stretch the rope. So now, since there's no vines, so no problem, plant under the rope. But if you stretch this rope with the purpose to train the vine so it can climb over, already now, it has the status of a trellis. It's like those lattice work for the trellis. And it's forbidden to plant under it, because planting under it is like planting under a vine.